Can the existence of a human soul actually be demonstrated? I will never forget biology class in high school. The teacher put a candle in front of the class and he lit the flame. And he asked us, "Is this flame alive?" And we all said, "No, it's not alive." But he challenged us. He said, "Prove it to me that it's not alive." And so one by one, we all offered a reason as to why it wasn't alive. Somebody said that it wasn't alive because it couldn't grow. And he lit a piece of paper on fire and he showed that it was growing. Somebody else said it wasn't alive because it couldn't reproduce. And he took another candle and showed that it reproduced. Somebody else said that it couldn't die, and he took a glass over and suffocated it and showed that it could die. And for every reason that we gave, he demonstrated that that reasoning was false. In the same way, you guys have been challenging me over the last couple of weeks as I've made these videos on this theme of logical reasoning. You guys have had some great feedback in the comments, and I want to ask you to continue to do that. I've learned a lot from you guys. It seems as though we agree more often than we disagree. Once we settle on the correct terminology or the correct vocabulary to use, we find that we agree on, we're talking about the same thing, we're just using different words. And I think that's the case for today's video on the human soul. I think once we go through the process of explaining the human soul from a Christian perspective, I think you'll see that you probably agree with everything. You were just using different terms. Perhaps you were coming at it from a psychological perspective, where we were coming at it from a philosophical perspective. But I do want to clarify the modern idea that comes from Descartes. I think it's called dualism, where there is a spirit that's trapped in a material body, and the spirit is the pilot, or and the body is the ship. That is not the Christian idea of a soul. So what is the human soul? To demonstrate this, I need some help. This is a rock. I know there's some skeptics who watch this channel. I really appreciate having you here. I really appreciate what you add in the comments. But I'm not going to waste our precious time to prove that this is a rock. We're just going to call it self-evident for right now. I think our relationship has evolved to that point. So I also need, actually, that would be a bad example. Let's try that again. That's much better. Now, this item right here is alive. And I'm going to prove that through a process called the scientific method. No, I'm not. We're going to call that self-evident also. So, both of these things are matter, but this one is alive. This one has a soul. This one does not. This plant has what's called a vegetative soul. The vegetative soul makes this plant alive and gives it the power to grow, to have nutrition, and to reproduce. A simple observation, what we might call self-evident, would show that this matter, unlike this matter, is not alive, it cannot grow, and it cannot reproduce. It's just lifeless matter. This is the most basic form of what we mean when we use the term a soul. This is a very simple soul. We call this the vegetative soul. Next, let's look at what's called the sensitive soul. This is a duck. This duck has what's called a sensitive soul. A sensitive soul has all the powers that the vegetative soul has, but in addition, Danny has the power of locomotion. She can move. She also has 5 external senses. She also has memory, imagination, and common sense. She also has 11 types of emotions or passions. She's also scared to death right now. So I apologize, but I'm going to have to represent humanity in this whole video experiment. I wish I had somebody better as an example, but you're stuck with me. So I have what's called a rational soul. The rational soul has a will and an intellect. It also has passions. The will, the purpose of the will is to pursue what I perceive as the good. We discussed that in last week's video. The purpose of the intellect, or the function, the power of the intellect, is to reason. Reason has 3 levels or 3 degrees: to understand a concept, to make judgments about that concept, and then to reason abstractly about that concept and perhaps come up with something new. But the question is, isn't this just chemical activity in the brain? Well, yes and no. So typically at this point, the challenge is that this doesn't mean you have a soul. This is just chemical reactions in the brain. But if that's the case, if it's just chemicals, then it could be reproduced, right? I mean, if we get some test tubes and we experiment with endorphins, serotonin, and dopamine in different mixtures, I mean, eventually some abstract thought will come from the test tube, correct? Oh, you want it in brain matter. Okay, so my dog has brain matter and the exact same chemicals in her brain. There's no abstract thought happening there. Apes. Okay, forget apes. Let's talk about humans, okay? Can we reproduce a reaction in humans? I thought I could when I was in high school. I was dating a girl. At the beginning of the relationship, I gave her flowers, and she was extremely ecstatic. I was a hero. I thought, man, I figured this out. 6 months later, she wasn't too happy with me, and I gave her flowers, and I was expecting to reproduce the same reaction. What I didn't understand was human free will, part of the human soul. Interestingly enough, my dog gives me the exact same reaction, the same response. I can reproduce the same reaction every single time I pull out a Frisbee or every time I pull out the box of treats. I can reproduce because my dog doesn't have a will. Watching a brain scan and seeing different parts of the brain light up when it's exposed to different sensory input or feels different emotions, that doesn't explain where thoughts come from. That just shows the integration of the body and the soul. So observing the signals pass through the neurons and watching new dendrites form and making a connection between that activity and the origin of abstract thought without really having an understanding or having a reason to make that connection. Alexa, what is the definition of superstition?
The noun superstition is usually defined as a belief or notion, not based on reason or knowledge.
The soul is the form of the body. Therefore, they experience things in common. And what I mean by that is the physical stomach, when the physical stomach is hungry, the will desires to have a cheeseburger. When the emotions are sad, the body produces tears. When you are imagining something beautiful, a brain scan can show brain activity. The science of the body does not contradict what we teach. It actually confirms what we teach. Now, I may have explained it poorly, but it doesn't contradict it. It confirms it. So is the soul spiritual? By spiritual, I want to clarify, I do not mean supernatural. God is supernatural. We, humans, we are natural. So our bodies and our souls are natural. But our body is material, our brain, our stomach, that is the matter of our body. Our soul, which is not our brain, our soul is spiritual. Now, can that be demonstrated? I think so. I would like for you to imagine an apple. Is the apple real? Does it exist? Well, it doesn't exist physically made out of matter. But if I ask you to describe the apple to me, you probably would describe it yellow, red. So if you can describe what you're seeing, then it would be hard to argue that it's real. It's just not materially real, but it does exist. You're describing it. Now, an apple may be too generic. Imagine a burger for me. Imagine a hamburger. Now, what kind of hamburger did you imagine? Did you imagine like a restaurant burger, or did you imagine the little McDonald's burger? I imagined that thing with the egg on it. I live in Tennessee. We have these barbecue restaurants. It's kind of gross, but I bet you weren't imagining that. So is the thing I was imagining, is it real? Well, it's not some generic idea of an apple, and I can describe it to you. It's just not real in a material world, but I can describe it to you. That's what we mean by spiritual, that there is something there. It just doesn't exist in the material. So what about art? The artist conceives in his imagination some form of art. It only exists in his imagination. It doesn't exist anywhere on the face of the earth, just in his imagination. But going through the process of using his tools, going through the method, like we talked about in last week's video, he creates in the material world what only existed spiritually. Now, when he's done, we can see what he once was the only one that was able to see. We can see this material thing that came out of the spiritual. Now, the challenge often here is that the ability to create something materially is not evidence of a soul. Spiders create spider webs, right? But spiders don't put themselves into their spider webs. What do I mean by that? Well, if I look at a spider web, I can tell that an orb spider made that spider web, but I can't tell that Charlotte made that spider web. In the story Charlotte's Web, you see the spider made this web, and in that web, she's communicating something of herself, her love for Wilbur, in that web. So at the end of the story, I know spoilers here, but at the end of the story, when she dies, what's left is this artistic representation of who she is in the physical world that she created. It came out of who she is, and now she created it in the physical world. But in real life, obviously, spiders don't do that, but humans do. A very poor example of this would be a bridge. The spider makes a web because it serves a function, right? Well, humans make bridges because they serve a function. Go ahead and right now, Google in another window, bridge, and click on images and look at all the different bridges that are there. Some of them are very basic and very, just form. There's no emotion in it. But some of those bridges, you can look at those bridges and you can see something about the creator of that bridge. You can see something of himself in the bridge that, maybe like he just won a battle and he created this thing to show how great he was. Or maybe he was a simple, humble man and he made this small little bridge. You can see something of the creator in the bridge. Even the bridges that are just form, ugly, functional bridges, right? Nothing great about them. Even those bridges communicate something about their creator, like he was lazy or he was on a budget. It's not a perfect representation of the creator of the bridge, but we are able to put something into what we create so that the next generation or 100 years from now, somebody can look at that object and see something of ourselves. Now, a bridge is an awful example, but let's try something else. Let's try something like a skyscraper or art, or what about the song Imagine by John Lennon? I never met John Lennon, but listening to that song, there's something of himself in that song, and I know something about him that's been transmitted through time. So when we create art or architecture or anything, and then we die, 100 years from now, somebody can look at what we've created, especially if we were a very gifted and talented artist. Somebody can look at what we've created and they can see something of who we are. A perfect example of this would be Picasso. I mean, any artist, but let's just pick on Picasso, okay? So let's say that somebody in the world creates a fake Picasso, just the most amazing fake that any of us might be fooled by. If we were to hang that fake in the right setting, let's say the museum in the right place and try to pawn it off as the real thing, right? If you brought 100 art experts in, they would all, I think, they would all be able to determine that it was a fake. Not because it's not done well or accurately, but because there's something inherent about Picasso that's in Picasso's paintings. And I think people who are familiar with Picasso, I'm not, but people who are familiar with Picasso can look at his paintings and they can see something of who he is inside his paintings. And so a fake just wouldn't work. Not for an expert, not for 100 experts anyways. Is this flame alive? No. Science has determined that fire has no genetic information to pass on to the next generation. Also, its molecules are just pure energy. So it's not alive. The funny thing is, long before technology had advanced far enough for science to determine that, we already knew it wasn't alive. How can that be? Well, it's self-evident, and we use logical reasoning